Whitney Keys, the Executive Director of Seattle City Club. Wanted to let you know before we start our Civic Cocktail program, I want to thank the Seattle Channel, our longtime media partner, and Town Hall, our nonprofit program partner. Town Hall's inspiring programs create an engaged community and ensure that everyone has a voice. Civic Cocktail wouldn't be possible without generous sponsorship from Comcast, our premier sponsor. Did you know that for about 40 years, Seattle City Club has been working hard to inform, connect, and engage people around civics to help strengthen our region? We create opportunities for diverse voices and different perspectives to be shared in respectful, thoughtful ways. And you can be a part of the conversation tonight by sharing your questions in the chat box during the program. While they may not all be answered, we are going to read all of them, and we really value your contributions. Seattle City Club is hosting a couple other events coming up the rest of this year in November and December, including civic boot camps coming up on November 6th and 13th. They're going to be focused on diversity and equity in local government. And you won't want to miss our 2020 Year in Review program. Information about all of these are on our website at seattlecityclub.org. Shifting back to Civic Cocktail, for nonprofits like Seattle City Club and Town Hall to come together to produce this type of a program, it takes a lot of work and a lot of resources. And so tonight, immediately following the program or during the program, you can give online or text to give using the word civics. And that would be to the number 44321. Everything that's donated will be split 50% between our organizations. So thank you in advance for your support. And now it's time to grab the drink of your choice, sit back, relax, and enjoy Civic Cocktail with our host, Joni Balter.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Civic Cocktail. I'm Joni Balter, and tonight we are discussing Election Week, as we must now refer to it, with two fantastic guests. We have Congressmember-elect Marilyn Strickland from Washington's 10th Congressional District. She will be the first African-American member of our delegation and the first Korean-American woman in Congress. And she's a Democrat. Also here to look back and look forward is former State Attorney General Rob McKenna, who ran a strong race for governor in 2012. He is a Republican. Thank you both. I'm delighted to have you with us. So to start, what are the big takeaways from the election so far? I'm going to start with you, Congresswoman-elect Marilyn Strickland. I bet you like the way that sounds. Take it away.
Yes, so as we look at the national elections, I do believe that the Democrats did lose a few seats, but at the same time have maintained the majority. We know right now that the presidential election is very, very tight. And if you look at what's happened throughout the state, I'd say that, we had Kim Schreier hold on to her seat. I was successful in the 10th. Carolyn Long was unsuccessful. So as you look at the balance of power, it really hasn't changed in Washington state when it comes to those elections. At the state level, though, we have some history in the making. We had, I believe, 4 African-American women run, and they were all challengers, and they were all successful. And I know that there'll be another drop of, results. And so overall, a lot of people who are from diverse communities are running for office, which I think is a good thing because it adds to the richness of our discussion with a different lived experience and perspective. At the same time, at the federal level, we're still kind of waiting to see what happens with the presidential election.
Rob McKenna, what were your big takeaways?
Well, nationally, I think we saw less change than a lot of people thought we might. Even if the presidency flips, it was so razor thin in 2016 that it can flip the other way, and looks like it will without a dramatic shift. Most of the states are voting about the way they did last time, with just enough of a difference to allow, for example, Vice President Biden to win Wisconsin. One of my favorite states to look at for this purpose is North Carolina. It is hard to imagine a more closely divided state than the Tar Heel state. If you look at every statewide office in North Carolina, it's split pretty much down the middle. So not dramatic differences. Obviously, we're going to see divided government in Washington, D.C. It looks like the Senate is going to remain in the hands of the Republicans, for example. Slight narrowing of the Democratic advantage in the U.S. House. In our state, Democrats definitely gained ground overall. I wouldn't say dramatically so. We've seen bigger differences in control levels in past years, but still they did expand their control a little bit in the Senate and in the House, and with continuing control of all three branches of state government. I think that they will be very active, and they'll be passing a lot of policies that will give Republicans plenty of grist for the mill in 2022. So should be a fun 2 years.
Any thoughts on the future of the polling industrial complex, Rob McKenna?
Well, of course, the pollsters are coming in for a lot of criticism again this time, but the fact is they got it right more this time than they did in 2016 when they failed to detect and report a breaking of late deciding voters towards Trump, which is why he won. This time, though, there just weren't as many undecided voters, and that's not surprising because you had an incumbent facing a challenger, not two people competing for an open White House. So it was not surprising that there were fewer undecided voters, and therefore there weren't as many surprises in the polling. But I do think one factor that was in play here is the factor we've seen before in places like California and South Carolina, where you see an underreporting in the polling by the people responding to the polls about who they're going to vote for. One estimate I saw was that about 5% of people who talked to the pollsters lied about who they were going to vote for. They didn't admit they were going to vote for Trump.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you used that word because that is exactly what I said when I was watching these returns last night.
Yeah.
I happen to be originally from the state of Pennsylvania, and people are making fun as I think one of the comedians said, the human body was not built to spend so much time thinking about what's going on in Pennsylvania. But really, I mean, I don't think, sorry, fellow Pennsylvanians, that folks there tell pollsters what they're doing. I think they think it's their own business, and I don't know why they engage them, but with them. But that was just a thought that I had as well. Marilyn Strickland, what do you think about this? Did you have some polling that gave you a headache?
Yeah, we had polling, and it was, we had Anna Greenberg of GQR is a well-known national pollster, and that's who we work with. And she was spot on in the primary election, and she was pretty spot on for the general election. So as far as running a campaign for Congress, it worked out well. But I think the interesting point about polling is that, when you're in a campaign, you do a lot of outreach to voters, and, you're sending them text messages and you're calling them. And even, I've been on the phone with folks even doing fundraising, and, you ask voters like, how are you, da, 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 da. And even sometimes when I was doing phone banking about my own race, people are reticent to tell you who they're voting for. Now, granted, when the candidate's on the phone, is probably more awkward than having a volunteer do it. But some people they're just sacred about it. It's like, it's none of your business. I voted, it was a secret ballot, and you don't need to know who I voted for or where I'm leaning. And so to your point, and I think also, Rob, you're right. I just think for some people, they just didn't want to tell you they were voting for Trump. Another thing I think is interesting in all of this too, though, is that if we look at right now what's happening in Georgia, right? Red Georgia. And, if you look at the growth of Fulton County and Atlanta right now, we're waiting for results, and it is entirely possible that Georgia could flip unless something happened in the last 10 minutes that I didn't see on CNN. And so I think that, the electorate is changing.
You're not watching CNN now while we're talking.
But again, with polling, it's how reliable is it, and how comfortable are people sharing with a stranger on the phone how they're going to vote. And I think Rob is absolutely right when he says that when it came to Trump, some people just didn't want to give up the goods, and they weren't being truthful.
One other point I would also add, I should have made this point at the beginning, the pollsters always remind us that the numbers they report have a margin of error, plus or minus.
Yep.
Absolutely.
They've never claimed that what they do is perfect, right?
Right.
It's plus or minus 3% or plus or minus 4%. So in very close elections, we really shouldn't be surprised that the election goes, in a different direction than the poll results showed us, if in fact, it's within the margin of error to begin with. So.
Yep, that's true.
So I'm going to go to an audience question for Maria. It's for both of you. Marilyn Strickland, you'll start.
Okay.
And then I want to follow up with something, because this speaks to something I was going to ask. So with the current division in our country, what advice do you have for those of us who are exhausted?
Well, I will tell you that everyone's exhausted. People who are current elected officials, people who are former elected officials, and those of us who are getting back into the game. And as we talk to folks across the district, across the state, people are just exhausted. And so The one thing that we have to be able to do, I'd say there are two things. You know, there's no denying that even within the parties, there is division. And so we have to be able to find some kind of way to mend some of the drama happening within the parties and think about how we can listen to each other. And then the conversation about reaching across the aisle. I mean, with social media, with the way that we kind of get put into echo chambers, we're just used to being around people who are too like-minded too often. And it's bad for democracy. And so listen, and listen to someone who may not share your point of view, not because they're going to change your mind, but just because you have to ask the question, why do you think that's true? And sometimes you get an answer that you think is completely irrational, but sometimes it gives you a chance to dig deeper and learn something about where someone's coming from. So for me, it's like, just learn to listen, especially if you're interacting with someone whose ideas may not necessarily mesh with yours.
Are you exhausted, Rob McKenna?
Not as much as I was 4 years ago. You know, I think that people have earned their exhaustion, and it's been a very long 4 years, certainly a very long 2 years since the Democratic primaries kicked off in earnest in early 2019. So if we're tired, it's for a reason. What should people hope for and look for? They should hope for and look for their leaders who they've just elected or re-elected to get together and start putting solutions on the table and adopting them. And that's the great thing about electing people like Marilyn to Congress is, Marilyn, you're going to bring, because I know you've known you many years, you're going to bring a lot of energy, optimism, and pragmatism to the task. And you're going to be, like most new elected leaders, you're going to be looking for things you can get done. And that's what we need. The people of our country need to see their elected leaders accomplishing something. And you know, I'll give you one example. I would hope that Congress and the White House will start by crafting an effective and meaningful response to the COVID pandemic. Yeah. We've been lacking a coordinated, effective national response. We need one. And that would be a good place to start. And there are many other examples we can think of as well. But I will say this, I've been going back to DC now since the early 1990s for one reason or another. And what struck me more than anything,
I saw you in DC. I bumped into you on the street in DC.
That's right, you did. I remember that. Yeah, yeah. And it's just, what has struck me is that over the years, I see that more and more the problem is that Republicans are more afraid of their own party than the other side, and Democrats the same. It's to your point, Marilyn. You said you've got to resolve intra-party differences. Obviously, those were on display in your race, where you had a challenger from your own party. But in D.C., it really does feel like people are more concerned about a primary than a general, and that kind of paralyzes them because they're afraid of being criticized for working with the other side. Now, I think one of the strengths that Vice President Biden will bring to the White House as President Biden is he knows how to work across the aisle. He knows how to work with the legislative branch. He will replace someone who exploited division and tried to expand division and divisiveness. But frankly, President Obama was not as good at bringing people together as I hoped he would be himself. He was evidently not that comfortable working. Well, he wasn't comfortable at all working with Republicans in Congress to make deals. I think President Biden will be better at that if he, in fact, becomes president. And I think his experience on the Hill will feed into that. Just like people who are former governors often make better presidents because they have a lot of experience working with the legislative branch, such as Bill Clinton, who's effective that way, George Bush, and others.
But I do add that.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, but I mean, I want to push back a bit about Barack Obama not wanting to work with people because, when he ran, he talked about unity and he talked about having problems that transcend all of us. And, you can't deny the fact that there was a comment made by the leadership that said, we want to make Barack Obama a one-term president. There was a lot of effort to not work with him. And so I'm not saying that, he was necessarily perfect, but I want to make sure that we clear the record that, he was willing to work with people, but they weren't necessarily interested in working with him.
This feeling of exhaustion. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I understand what you're saying, Marilyn, and I don't want to overstate the matter, but, my friends in Congress, in the House and the Senate, and people in pretty senior positions were very frustrated that, especially in the second term, he just wasn't interested in their view. I understand you're right. They of course they went after him, but the fact is that prior Democratic presidents were more effective at working with Republican Congresses. And all I'm saying is that's in the past. I just hope President Biden can be effective because it does look like we're heading into a period of divided government.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and he's had a long-standing relationship with a lot of people in both chambers, and so that will definitely make him more effective.
So, New York Times columnist David Brooks often writes about the exhausted majority, uh, and he's used this phrase a couple times going back several years. So, I just want to read to sort of wrap up this segment here, this part of the segment. The exhausted majority, he wrote, are people simply worn out by the endless war between these two armies. He means political parties. Exhaustion has become an independent force in modern politics. Many people vote for whatever candidate will exhaust them less. So,
Mm.
anyway, I want to move on to something that I find exhausting, which is the idea that there may be a whole bunch of lawsuits on the presidential race. And so, Rob McKenna, I'm not going to
Yeah.
miss the fact that you're a lawyer, an attorney general who can maybe enlighten us on this. Can you stop ballot counting in the middle of counts? What about
Nope,
these lawsuits? No?
nope,
In a word,
nope,
no.
Really?
nope. You
My
can't.
favorite kind
Look,
of interview, one word
yeah,
answer.
no.
No.
Next question. No, look. I mean,
What
what
about the
President
folder you
Trump's
showed me earlier?
Yeah, so I've got a yellow pad full of notes about current cases that are being filed, but this is a very different situation than what we faced in 2000, when the vote counting in Florida went on and on and on. And ultimately, in the Bush v. Gore decision, a majority of the Supreme Court ruled that to continue recounting would violate the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution because the standards for recounting were different from county to county. And so the odds of you getting your ballot recounted or counted in some cases depended on where the ballot was cast. They said that violated equal protection, but that only happened. That only happened because the election came down to one state and who would
That's
win
the
the
question
electoral
I was
votes.
wondering. Right. You
And
can't just random all the states that didn't like me, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you recall, President Bush ended up carrying Florida by 537 votes. So the presidential election of 2000 was decided, arguably, by 537 votes, right? So the problem with these new cases, and there have been over 300 cases filed over the last 2-3 months, but particularly the problem with the cases that we're seeing unfold now, for example, in Pennsylvania, challenging whether or not ballots can be counted that arrive after Election Day. The problem is these are lawsuits that don't have adequate facts supporting them, and if you don't have facts, you really can't make the constitutional argument. So, the case you want to think about the most and be the most concerned about is in Pennsylvania. There are 2 lawsuits, but particularly the one challenging ballots arriving after Election Day, because in Pennsylvania, the state law says ballots have to arrive by Election Day. The state Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, however, ruled that statute is unconstitutional, and they just made up a new deadline. They said, okay, we're going to say that if the ballots arrive within 3 days, they can be counted. That was taken up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case, 4-4 split, but that means 4 justices on the Supreme Court said, yeah, bring it back to us later, which the White House is already planning to do. Okay, fine. But if Biden wins the Electoral College by carrying Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, and one more state, he's going to win, right? Michigan, right? Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona. He's win. He doesn't need Arizona. I mean, he doesn't need Pennsylvania. If he doesn't need Pennsylvania, that really takes the pressure off. You don't have the Bush v. Gore Florida factor. And the last thing I'll say about this is that the Supreme Court, in a year where it came down to one state and a handful of ballots, they showed their ideological colors. They're not going to flip this election if it's clear one candidate is winning. It's just not going to happen, because they're going to be too concerned about protecting the integrity of the institution, and they're just too smart for that, I think.
We have a question from Daniel for Rob McKenna. And it seems like Republicans are doing very well nationally, but have increasingly struggled in Washington state. What do Washington Republicans need to do better? And you have some thoughts about that, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. And this has been a long-term trend. We've seen it in other West Coast states as well. A lot of it's demographic, people moving into the area who are not voting Republican. In 2012, Jay Inslee's entire margin of victory over me came from 2 legislative districts in Seattle. I won 47 out of 49 districts in the state taken as a whole. But the demographic changes have continued, right? So it's hard. Compounding that is the following problem. You've got two Democratic parties and you've got two Republican parties. This is an insight that my wife Amy shared with me, right? You've got the Bernie Sanders Democrats, that wing, the more progressive wing. You've got more traditional Democrats like Maryland. In the Republican Party, you've got more traditional Chamber of Commerce Republicans like me, and you've got the Trump Republicans. Many Trump Republicans don't even like the Republican Party; they just like Trump, right? So what we saw in the governor's race this time with Mr. Culp's race is the hard kernel of Republican support in this state, 40%. Well, you can't win with 40%. You know, that's a 20% deficit. So what Republicans are going to struggle with is the following. How do we keep the base while expanding it to pull in more folks to get to a majority? It's very hard to do. In Washington, it's especially hard in statewide races because we're one of only 10 states in the country where the statewide officers run when the president's on the ballot, when the turnout factors really favor Democrats.
That's a built-in wedge for Republicans. They always have to run during the presidential years, which are big turnout, which are big Democrats here.
Right. So 2 years after I ran for governor in 2012, in 2014, the following states elected Republicans as governor: Vermont, Massachusetts, Maryland, and Illinois. Now, I have to say, in Vermont, they just reelected their Republican governor with 67% of the vote. They have to run every 2 years there, which is nuts. But here in our state, we clearly face a challenge because we've got two Republican parties. Democrats are facing somewhat similar challenges.
That's kind of what I want to bring Marilyn in on. She Marilyn Strickland, you ran as a moderate D against Beth Dolio, more liberal, and there was money put against you by that part of the party. So how challenging is it going to be for you, Marilyn, to work within your own party in DC and even with some of the delegation? There's some real lefties running around here.
Well, I mean, when you think about the composition of the Washington State congressional delegation, the majority of them who are Democrats are New Dems, and that's part of the New Dems coalition, which tends to be pro-innovation, pro-growth, and really thinking very thoughtfully. And I would say we tend to be left of center. On some policies, we are progressive. On some policies, we're more moderate. And so as you look at what I'm calling the intramural food fight that happened in my race, there was, when all said and done, over $1 million worth of money came in from outside in my race. And I still won the primary and I won the general election. And so I think the conversation really for us is, given what we are facing as a nation and the pandemic, the economic crisis, the racial injustice, healthcare, all these really big, heady issues in front of us, and climate change, we have to find a way to come together as a party and say, okay, how are we actually going to make progress? And I think this is where there can be a difference with the two parties, with the factions within the party. Because for me, the definition of progressive is actually making progress on things. And so I tell people that, being a woman who is half Black and half Korean, people have been trying to affix labels to me my entire life. And so for me, kept coming out of local government, having served as the mayor, even though I'm a lifelong Democrat and a proud Obama delegate, when he first ran for president, I've always focused on the problem. What is a problem that we're trying to solve? How do we find a solution and how do we get there? And sometimes within inter-party fights, it really has to do with disagreeing on how you get there. I think everyone agrees that this is the problem we want to solve, but sometimes the nuance is the difference in how do we get there. And so, how do you manage it? You have to have relationships with people. You have to understand that a lot of legislation is horse trading. And, ideally when things work out the way they should, we can solve problems together and we give everyone an opportunity to take a victory lap and to say they did something for their district. But that is a lot easier said than done. And so I'm hopeful that given what we're facing now as a nation, that we are all going to be able to at least think about what problems do we have to solve. We need a relief package because people are hurting right now. People are afraid for their lives and livelihoods. So much of our economy in Washington State depends on tourism, which means that until we get COVID under control, people are not going to feel comfortable getting on airplanes, eating in restaurants, staying in hotels, and doing all the things that we know really help drive a big part of our economy. Kids are not going to go back to school. And so, as Rob said earlier, having a national strategy around COVID, which is desperately needed because this 50-state random strategy is not going to cut it because we're not going to have a sustainable healthcare recovery or economic recovery until we get COVID under control.
So, Rob McKenna, just to continue with the future of the Republican Party here in Washington State, will you run for governor again? I always ask you this. I ask you this every time I see you, it seems like. Will you run?
No, I won't run because as you and I have discussed, I've given 17 years to public service, and I'm doing other things now, which are fun and making up for lost time from being in the public sector for so many years, doing things in the private sector. But I will support good candidates, and I'll be looking for good candidates to support because within a party, if you're having problems because of a division, and this is inevitable in either party because we only have two political parties, right? The two major parties, so it's always going to be stresses and strains internally. So I'm going to be looking for candidates who I can support, who are pragmatic, and are solution
Do you have
oriented.
any names in mind of people?
Sure.
As we mentioned earlier, your party ran a pretty obscure candidate for governor this time and only got 40%. I mean, a
Yeah.
police chief from Eastern Washington wasn't going to really,
Right.
win big in Puget Sound, which you have to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, we saw this happen in 1996 when it was a very crowded Republican primary, and Ellen Craswell became the nominee with 15, 16% of the primary vote. She had that hardcore slice of the vote, but it wasn't enough to win, although she did outperform Mr. Culp. I think she got 43 or 44% against Gary Locke. Today, or this year, a lot of really credible potential candidates decided to sit it out before COVID.
They
I
didn't
bet
want to
they're
run
really
with
glad
Trump, is that it?
yeah, that's right, and I'm sure they're really glad now they didn't run because running when there's a COVID pandemic must be really hard, Marilyn. I can't even imagine what it's like to campaign in this circumstance. So what's going to happen is that you're going to see people like Pierce County Executive Bruce Dameyer, State Representative J.T. Wilcox, and other, I think, credible, established leaders take a hard look at it in 4 years or sooner if Governor Inslee departs to join a Biden administration.
Yeah, it could be quite a race in 2021, I think.
Yeah.
So I have an audience question for Maria for both Marilyn and Rob McKenna. Should the Electoral College be abolished? And if so, why or why not? What would it take to abolish it?
I believe it would take a constitutional amendment, would it not?
Yes.
Yes,
And
it would.
yeah, I mean, and the Electoral College is a relic of a different time. It was, some of it was used to preserve the institution of slavery because the slave states wanted more of an outsized influence. It was also done in some ways because they didn't think that the general public had the sophistication to pick the right person. But if you look at how it really is not the example of proportional representation, it's just hard to make a strong case for why it should stay.
And your thoughts?
So two thoughts. One is about why it's not going to change. Well, I'm saying the reason it won't change and the reason it shouldn't change. Those are the 2 points I want to make. The reason it isn't going to change is that to amend the United States Constitution, you need 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to agree on the amendment. Then it has to go out, and 3/4 of the state legislatures, by majority votes in each legislature, have to vote to approve it. The reason that's not going to happen is that the small states are not going to give up their disproportionate influence, right? Now, the reason it shouldn't change as a matter of policy, in my opinion, is that it does protect the smaller states from being swamped by the bigger states. It is another key reason the Electoral College was created, because the small states were quite concerned about being swamped by big states like New York in those days, or Virginia. And so it was a compromise that was put into place to protect the smaller states. It reminds us that we are a republic. We're not France or Japan or South Korea or any other country that has a very strong centralized government. We are a republic, and a lot of the power in government resides at the state level and at the local level. And I don't think you're going to find anywhere near 3/4 of the states, much less 2/3 of their representatives in the Congress, voting to make those changes.
So just thinking about the time here, I want to move on a little bit here. So Marilyn, you have a business background. You were the president and CEO of the Greater Seattle Chamber of Commerce. How will that help you reach across the aisle, if it will, in Congress?
I mean, not just reaching across the aisle, but just being acutely aware of our employer community. And, when people think of chambers of commerce, they tend to think of the big global brands. And people often don't know that 80% of members of chambers of commerce tend to be small businesses. And so it's really a deep understanding of the economic ecosystem. And I talk about the interdependence. So you have larger companies who often do purchasing and procurement with smaller companies. Their employees are often the customers of smaller companies. And I want to make sure we don't forget that the revenues that flow from the employer community flow into the coffers of state and local government that help fund essential services. And so I think for me, understanding how that ecosystem works together is going to be important. And what we've seen during COVID is the elevation of small business. I mean, I've never heard this country talk about small business and elevate them the way they have during this pandemic. And it shows.
Does that tell us anything about what committees you'd like to be on in Congress?
Not necessarily.
Oh,
Not necessarily, but I think that having this familiarity and knowledge of how the business ecosystem works is a really big asset. And again, even before the pandemic, small businesses were struggling. I think people don't understand that even if you own a small business when times are good, you're not rolling in dough. Sometimes people are barely breaking even. And so just understanding how the ecosystem works. And for me, especially with minority and women-owned businesses, because sometimes they get overlooked, bringing that lens and perspective can really help make this economy more inclusive as we try to address relief funds and also how we come out of COVID.
so Rob, I have a question for you about Jay Inslee, your one-time nemesis. How do you think he's handled COVID?
So you make him sound like a Marvel comic books character, or both
Yeah.
of us, his nemesis. So
Well, I'll find a better word.
Yeah. Look, I think that Governor Inslee has done a number of things right. I think he took swift action, he took strong action to try to get the virus under control. So I don't have much critical to say about him. I've never been one who thinks that it's some sort of infringement on my personal liberties to be asked to wear a mask. It's actually common sense, and if you want to be a hero, wear a mask and protect other people, even if you don't care about yourself. I mean, obviously, when they were projecting what to do and when to do it, they probably got some things wrong because they didn't have perfect information. But overall, I think this state has taken the right steps. And what concerns me the most about where we're going with COVID is the number of people who appear to be saying nationally that we're not going to get it under control. Let's just give up. Let's just stop wearing masks. Let's let it run its course. That sounds great until you personally know someone, as many people do, who has become really ill with COVID. It is a very dangerous disease, and even if you don't die from it, my friends who are in the healthcare professions tell me that if you've been in the hospital with it, you are likely to suffer permanent lung damage from it. Dying isn't the only outcome that's really negative. So, here's the thing though. It's going to get worse before it gets better, just because of the time of year, and as we're seeing in countries that took really strong measures, spikes: France, Spain, Germany, etc. So I wonder whether anything anyone has done in the absence of much more rapid testing, much more widely available, followed by contact tracing. In the absence of those steps and before a vaccine, I'm not optimistic that it's going to get better before it gets worse.
Marilyn, did you want to add something there just before we wrap up here real quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that, Governor Inslee handled it very well. He took it very seriously. He made his decisions based on science. And as the first state where COVID showed up, he had to take swift action. And so I applaud what he did. And it was very, very hard for him to make some of those decisions. I mean, closing down businesses is always a hard call, but his job is to protect the health, safety, and well-being of the people he represents. And so I think he did a good job.
Very good, thank you. We could keep going all night here on election week, but we have been mopping up the 2020 election with former State Attorney General Rob McKenna and Washington's newest member of Congress, Marilyn Strickland. Great discussion. Thank you both so much. We are coming right back with a little Zen. What I mean is, we have two of the three Interfaith Amigos. These are religious people who advocate compassion and healing, and we think they are the perfect antidote to election angst. And we are back. So happy to be here virtually with two guys who calm you down just about the minute they start speaking about compassion and unconditional love. It's my pleasure to introduce Pastor Don Mackenzie and Imam Jamal Rahman. Together, they and a rabbi who was unable to attend tonight form the Interfaith Amigos. Their approach includes a little humor, a lot of compassion, and some music.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah.
Adonai hu ha Elohim hu. Adonai hu ha Elohim hu. It's all one and I am as I am. It's all one and I am as I am.
So that's your theme song. Tell us just some of it. We could tell exactly what it means, but some of it we could not.
Yeah, it's our signature song we do at the end of the program usually. And the words, they are in Arabic, in Hebrew, in English, and they celebrate compassion and unity and oneness. So the words I said, it translates to, this is a verse from the Quran, which opens every chapter of the Quran. It says, in the name of God, who is boundlessly compassionate, infinitely merciful, there is no God but God, meaning it's all one. Brother Don?
And the Hebrew that I sang said the absolute manifests as the one. And of course, the last verse is in English. It's all one and I am as I am. So we're talking about oneness. And when we do it, normally the three of us sing standing up together with our arms around each other. And we sing a lot better with it, when we're singing together. So there you have it.
But today we've channeled Brother Ted, the rabbi.
How did you guys get together? Where did you start and why did you start?
Actually, when 9/11 happened, Rabbi Ted Falcon, he invited me at the earliest opportunity to do a service in his synagogue. And the topic I remember at that time was about an insight from Mahatma Gandhi, who said that, if you judge a religion by the behavior of some people, then every single religion is in deep trouble. So we met at that time, and then we became friends. Also, our congregations, our families, and we started doing all kinds of interfaith programs together. And then we realized that this is the key to overcoming polarization, to really connect on a human level and become friends. Then it becomes difficult to dehumanize the other. And then, we realized we're cousins of the same Abrahamic family, but a very, very dysfunctional Abrahamic family. And we're missing our third cousin. That's where Don comes in.
So I joined them for an event to mark the first anniversary of 9/11. And afterwards, we were talking and said, we can't stop now. And we came together, I think, sharing an intuition that if we could penetrate the barriers that have separated our traditions historically, we might be able to get to a point where we could actually learn to cooperate in addressing the great moral issues that are always before the world. So after that, we started to meet weekly, and we've been meeting weekly since 9/11. We've written 3 books. We've probably given more than 250 presentations all over this country, several times in Japan and Canada, and twice to the Middle East. And we know each other pretty well, and we've been learning a lot from each other and from our audiences. So it's been quite a ride.
Yes.
So supporters of both political parties have been through excruciating weeks and months. And I think the big question on everyone's mind is, how can all of us heal after this pretty bruising election?
Well, in our line of work, we say that we really have to connect with the other on a human level. And there's a very common expression in Central Asia called 3 cups of tea. Can you share 3 cups of tea with the other? We have no choice, but no matter who the other is, we have to simply make that connection. And what are the 3 cups of tea? Listen, respect, and connect. Who is an enemy? An enemy is someone whose story I have not listened to. And what is listening? There's a wonderful uh, 13th century sage in Islam named Rumi. He says, metaphorically, listening is like putting your head on the person's chest and then just sinking into the answer. That's listening. Respect. I might be against that person's behavior, but that person's being, essence, is Christ's nature. So as I take the right action, say the right thing, can I make a differentiation between behavior and being? And just this discernment has the power to shift heaven and earth. And lastly, listen, respect, connect. So there's no need to talk about politics or religion. Let's start by sharing stories. This universe, the wonderful saying, is made out of stories, not atoms. Let's connect on a human level.
So, Pastor Mackenzie, you told me when we spoke before this show that the first way to build a relationship with someone you completely don't agree with, politically or otherwise, is to get to the truth. What do you mean by that?
Well, get to know each other, I think, and really, I think, be willing to listen carefully to the other person's story and the way that connects with what that person believes and so forth. And that's not easy. That takes time, but that's the foundation for the beginning of what we call interfaith dialogue that can lead to this kind of collaborative action that we feel is so necessary. So getting to know the other is the first stage in interfaith dialogue that we stumbled upon. And then we found 5 other things, quickly identifying what we call the core teachings of each of our traditions. In other words, moving from who we are as human beings to who we are as people of faith. And then, very importantly, taking a moment to consider the invitation to think about whether or not the verses and practices in our traditions are consistent with that core teaching or inconsistent, something people of faith have not really been asked to think about much. And that really helps to separate the things that are more egocentric from the things that are more rooted in spirituality. Jamal?
And the 4th stage is, after we have built some trust, some human connection, then we can enter into more difficult conversations. For example, for us, when we deal with Abrahamic interfaith associations, the question of Israel-Palestine, the elephant in the room, we can talk about it after we have a human connection. The 5th stage is we begin to realize that really all religions are paths to a shared universal. I'm a Muslim. I'm rooted in Islam. But when I'm open to the beauty and wisdom of other traditions, I find from my own experience, from my own being, that this waters my Islamic roots, makes me a better Muslim and a more developed human being, which is why we say interfaith is not about conversion. Interfaith is about completion, becoming a more developed, complete human being. And the last one is, it is critical to do that, what we call that inner inconvenient work. If I want to overcome racism, yes, legislation is critical, but the work of overcoming my conditioned biases is very critical. We talk about planetary degradation. A very wonderful scientist said, the biggest environmental problem is not loss of biodiversity, climate change, ecosystem collapse. It is selfishness, greed, and apathy. How do you overcome those spiritual practices?
Pastor Mackenzie, how does humor fit into the Interfaith Amigos? Like a lot of people, I imagine, when I heard that you were a rabbi, a pastor, and an imam, I instantly had 3 of you going into a bar somewhere. And so how does humor play into your group?
Well, I think humor makes us human beings, first of all. We're not just talking heads, we're not just stuffy religious leaders, but we really have a good sense of humor. And we feel that comedy can eclipse tragedy. Comedy, that's why laughing feels so good. Tragedy feels like things are never going to get any better. But when you laugh at a good joke, you're in the your soul gets the sense that things may get better and actually can get better. So we have various ways of telling jokes and so forth, and sometimes it's all ad hoc.
Well, I
Um,
saw you on a TED Talk. You guys came in and did a little Three Stooges routine at the
we did.
beginning of it, right?
Yes,
Do you do
yes.
that very often?
No, we don't. We don't. We've done it a couple times. We come in, we cross our legs simultaneously, and I say, you know, we're Three Stooges fans. In fact, we are the very incarnation of their famous phrase, I tried to think, but nothing happened.
Right.
Okay.
And sometimes we share some of these classical stories. Joni, in Islamic spiritual literature, there's a fictional character called the mullah, and through him, many profound truths are conveyed. So this is a very favorite one we do in many of our presentations. Is it okay if we do it? If I tell you that story, Joni?
Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
So here's the mullah. He goes to work. Lunchtime, opens his lunch pail box. What does he find? A cheese sandwich. Second day, third day, fourth day, always a lousy cheese sandwich. On the 10th day, I'm getting sick and tired of this lousy cheese sandwich.
Finally, his puzzled co-workers say, Mullah, why don't you go home and say to your wife, please, dear, make me a different kind of sandwich.
Now, I'm not married.
Who makes them?
I do. So this is really, it has many levels of meaning. One is, to really become aware of those conditioned cheese sandwich patterns. How can we overcome them unless we do this inner work of compassionate self-awareness?
So a lot of people, this election is not quite over, but it will be over at some point. Um, but the people are really avoiding conversations with other people. I know this is going on definitely in Seattle and many places. They want to avoid conflict and argument. Is that a good approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it depends on the context, whether you're talking about family or friends or whatever. I think in order to have the difficult conversations, we come back to the need to trust each other. And you can't trust each other really without having some level of knowing each other, knowing the stories that comprise that person's being and so forth. And once you've done that, I think talking is good. Without talking, it can be kind of poisonous. It builds up inside and so forth. Jamalji?
Yeah, I think that is probably the most important step and the most difficult step, to really create the environment where you can connect with the other on a human level. The holy books say this is the key, to come to know the other. But there's a verse in the Quran that says that, God has created some of you to be a trial for others. So it was not meant to be easy. But unless we really reach out and bond on a human level, we cannot get deep into more difficult conversations. Why don't we start with our own extended family?
Yeah. So what specific tips do you have for starting with your own extended family? Um, how do you have that conversation, connect on a human level, but not sort of set off fireworks unintentionally or intentionally?
Well, even with an adversary, I mean, I get a lot of people who are Islamophobic, for example, or have these biases. So they're adversarial, or they're against interfaith, studying different religions. So we say to them, is there anything I can tell you that will help you change your mind? If they're honest, they will say no. They will say, by the same token, anything you tell me is not going to help me change my mind, but now let us talk about things we can work together on collaboratively. Maybe some social justice projects, maybe some project on earth care. So in any way that we can, to create an environment where there is a human connection. The key is human connection. And that's an art, and that takes practice. It requires humility, it requires sincerity, it requires patience, and it requires persistence. But believe me, I know from my own experience, it works.
And I think in the beginnings, Joni, and especially in a family situation such as Thanksgiving,
Thank you. I was
I
going to
think,
ask you about Thanksgiving. How did you know
but
everybody's, not very many people are doing Thanksgiving necessarily this year, but if you are, you're wondering how you can, eat the turkey and not spill the gravy in a rage of some sort.
well, I think at the beginning, I think sometimes the best thing you can do is listen. And I think people need to be heard. And, ideally, the person might come back and say, tell me what you think, but maybe not, at least not at the beginning. When you can ask questions to clarify so you really fully understand or try to fully understand where that person's coming from. But that may be all that can happen for a while. And that may be all that happens ever. But, that's better than screaming at each other because we're not really trying to prove our self-worth to our family. We shouldn't be. We care about each other. We should be speaking to each other with respect and affection. And so listening is crucial. And I think a lot of people just need to be heard. I need to be heard.
Now, listening is an active sport. I've always said. I have a question from audience from Whitney for both of you. How do you begin to bridge a divide when someone's core moral values are in direct contrast to your own? So, what's the next step after listening, respect, and empathy when they won't do the same?
Right. The point I mentioned is very critical, that spiritual point. That can I make a distinction between behavior and being? Can I realize I'm against that person's behavior, but that person's being is Christ nature, Buddha nature, Elohim nature? For example, there's a wonderful mystic from India who says, do what is right, protect yourself, don't allow yourself to be abused, take the right action. But as you take the right action, I beg you, do not keep this person's essence out of your heart. And just this differentiation, as I take the right action in my words or in my deeds, it really makes a huge difference.
I think when you're talking with someone who really has such a different point of view, the main thing, following up on what Jamal just said, is to make sure that person feels he or she has been heard. And you ask questions to kind of clarify and so forth. And it's hard not to say, well, I disagree with that. But
You mean like the technique of first asking the question, which shows that you were in fact listening, because at least you're not dismissing it right off. You're letting them sort of air it out a little bit more because you were listening.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes there are people you just cannot connect with at that particular time.
Yeah.
And so you wait a little bit, perhaps. You say, maybe
Yes.
not at this dinner. We don't have to do it at this dinner. We can do it tomorrow or walking or a week from now or some
Yes.
other
Yes.
possibility. I bet a lot of people watching us are wondering, do they have to be religious to benefit from this interfaith approach to things? Can you benefit from this if you're not necessarily a religious person?
Oh, yeah. What is most critical are spiritual practices to become more Christ-like, Buddha-like, Elohim-like. So, for example, just practicing silence. There's no such thing as a Jewish silence or a Muslim silence or a Hindu silence. It's just silence. So if I practice silence regularly, it can have a profound effect within myself and with everybody I deal with.
We define a spiritual path, which for some people is a religion, but some is not, as something that provides purpose and meaning and which seeks to contribute to the common good. So you can be a person whose faith is traditional or not, but these dynamics that we're describing apply to everything.
Johnny, if I may say, I think we believe that everybody has faith, whether you call it religion or not. I love this story of an atheist who tells his son, there is no God. And the son, who's trained to be critical, have critical thinking, says, Father, how do you know? And the father says, son, you've got to take it on faith.
So, how do you balance the desire to share your philosophy or what you know about something? It's political, and you've got this extra little tidbit, and you want to share it, and then but you're trying to balance that with this great advocacy that both of you have been doing with the need to listen. So you get pretty excited, you're about to share it, but it's going to sound like this is my viewpoint. And yeah, I want to hear yours too, but I'm going to tell you this right now. I mean, it's that whole juxtaposition of things.
Yeah, well, I think that again, the first thing is to listen. I think it is possible under certain circumstances, and of course, it's all contextual. But I think it is possible to say, you know, I have a different view on that. Would you be willing to hear it?
Ooh, so you have to be invited, huh?
Well, I think if you're trying to make progress, yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
so what if you say, would you like to hear it? And the person says, not particularly.
Then we're done.
Ooh,
You're not going to get
how
everyone.
done? Why are you laughing, your mom?
No, I'm laughing because, all these different things that we're thinking about, it is also dependent on us doing all those practices to become more evolved, to become more mature. So unless we do that work, it is difficult to just, we can learn some techniques, but to make a structural change, I've got to do the work on myself to become more patient, more compassionate, more aware, more willing to listen. That work is critical.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question about that. So, in a class that I teach at Seattle University with a colleague of mine, it's on giving speeches, and we always tell the students that they have to be a little bit self-deprecating for the audience to like them. The audience will like you if you're a little bit self-deprecating. So, in these tough political conversations, you had mentioned humility. It's kind of the same idea in a way to not be so emphatic that your way is the only way. You kind of have to show a little give there, whether that's inviting them to hear you or just give the other person some room to hear you and see you as someone who doesn't think you have all the answers, I guess.
Oh,
No,
yes, humility, sincerity, patience, these are wonderful qualities to develop within oneself. And you can call them psychological exercises or spiritual exercises, but they are key. Don't you agree, Brother Don?
I do. And in our presentations, we almost always say what we're saying is by way of an invitation to you to think critically, to see whether or not your experience squares with this or not. But it's not, we never say you've got to believe what we believe. What we're trying to do is invite people to think critically about what gives their lives purpose and meaning, and as I said, contributes also to the common good.
Okay, so going back to Thanksgiving for a second here, I keep talking about people sort of avoiding conversations or finding softer, kinder ways of engaging about polarization, for example. But we're all in each of these scenarios, we're trying to avoid a heated discussion. Maybe a heated discussion is okay, or does the heat make that not work?
Anger is righteous anger is very beautiful. In fact, all the traditions say that it's a king over kings. But to serve the common good, it needs to be bridled. It needs to be restrained if it really wants to be of service. So yes, we can have heated discussion, but the danger is that if I am not able to practice self-restraint, it can get into very difficult areas from which I find it hard to extricate myself.
The other thing that's difficult about Thanksgiving is it's often an assembly of people who come from different places who don't see each other very often, and you can't suddenly get to third base in one sitting. And so sometimes, frankly, it's better not to say anything unless you're going to have a chance to follow up in some kind of systematic way to deepen that relationship and follow some of these steps.
Joni, I love poetry. There's a wonderful poet in Islamic literature named Hafiz, 14th century. He says, understand this, that anybody you meet, you're saying to yourself, please love me, please love me, please love me. But of course, you're saying this silently. Otherwise, somebody would call the cops. I mean, this is the poetry. So with that higher understanding, what this has done for me is given me a deeper understanding of somebody who seems standoffish, but really just wants to be loved, just wants that connection, but just doesn't know how. So it's up to me to create that environment where I'm able to, in some way, connect.
So we have to go here in a minute here, but 70% of, I read this survey that said 70% of Americans say the most important job after this election for all of us is to heal our enmity. What do you think? Is that gonna be possible?
I always love the words of Nelson Mandela. I remember his words when he walked out of prison, when he was freed. And the words he said was, if I am not able to leave behind my anger, my hatred, my bitterness, I will always be in prison. And that has made me realize it is critical for me to do this work.
So I have to hold it right there. We have been doing a little on-the-spot healing with 2 of the 3 Interfaith Amigos who advocate compassion and kindness in turbulent times. My great thanks to Pastor Don Mackenzie and Imam Jamal Rahman. Civic Cocktail is off for the holidays, but we are coming back strong in February. Good evening, and thank you so much for watching.